What's up, everyone? I just recently rewatched one of my favorite movies of all time. I hadn't watched it in a long time, and that is The Piano Teacher from 2001, directed by Michael Haneke, based on the novel by Alfred Jelinek from 1983. I'm not a cinephile, I'm not a big film buff, but this movie is crushing, deeply important to me. I'm going to do a little film review, but also get into sort of film analysis. I'm going to hone in on one topic ultimately in this movie. Basically, the general theme of what it's about is sadomasochism and sexual perversion and classical music. And there's lots of psychological and political dimensions to it, but I'm going to end up focusing in on this one angle that I haven't heard anyone talk about, and it's kind of important to me, which is this issue of how musical notation fits into the thematic world of this movie. And it's a very strange thing, the way musical notation, writing, sheet music, the score, modes of recording things and writing has this powerful and perverse presence in this movie and in music in general, which I'll talk a little bit about. The film is a very uncomfortable viewing. It's violent and disturbing. I mean, it's not as explicitly violent as something like Gaspar Noé, Irreversible or something like that. It's not stomach turning, but it's brutal. It's cold-blooded depiction of violence. So the premise is Erika Kohut is the main character. She is a piano teacher at a highly prestigious conservatory in Vienna. She's in her late 30s, early 40s. Erika is really cold, mean, harsh woman, cruel to her students, just really exacting, just an absolute stone-faced bitch, She lives in a tiny little apartment with her mother. They have a super dark, twisted relationship. The mother is this insane domineer who monitors Erika's every move and won't let her buy certain clothes and demeans her and smacks her and screams at her. And they sleep in the same bed. There's like some weird, I don't know if it's Oedipal or if you call that Electra complex. I don't, definitely some unsettled Freudian accounts going on with Erika Kohut. It starts with her teaching a bunch of piano lessons. Pretty soon we discover that she is a sexual pervert, as they used to say, a sexual deviant. She's into some brutal masochism, not in the good kink positive way. We're going to be kink negative in this movie, all right? She's damaged. She's not doing well. She spies on people while urinating, and it turns her on. She gets into some brutal self-harm stuff that's hard to watch. We learn that her father died in an insane asylum. He's nowhere to be found. We assume that's, she affected her and even genetically probably. So this young piano student enters. His name is Walter Klemmer. And he sort of seduces her, or she sort of seduces him. The power dynamic is complex. But his introduction, their relationship, sort of sets her off and crumbles her defenses, and she spirals off into a very chaotic relationship with this man. Once they get going, she writes him a long list of sexually sadistic things that she wants him to do to her, and that's when things really take off. I'm not going to spoil the end of the movie plot-wise, but I'm going to be spoiling certain things to analyze in it. Or maybe I'm not spoiling. Maybe this will plant a seed and you'll want to watch it with these things in mind. The acting is out of control. Well, very in control. It's crushingly deep. Isabella Huppert, or Huppert, I suppose, plays Erika, and she is just the most powerful. I mean, she can just, they'll zoom in on her face, and she'll just be stone-faced and just curl her lip like a millimeter, just one eyebrow raise, a little wince, just communicates just oceanic emotion and tension. It's just a super tense movie, at least for the first half. I love the musical details in this. Like, the kind of instruction that she gives to her students is so legit. Like, it's so authentic and like stuff that you really would hear in a top level conservatory. They just get it right. And I mean, I think a lot of that was from the novel. I read the book a while ago. I haven't reread that in a while. The stuff I'm talking about, though, I know it's in both the book and the movie. I think Alfred Jelinek knows quite a bit about classical music as well. She's a pianist. So the whole milieu that the movie is set in is so cool. It's just completely cloistered in this like bubble of the conservatory and just rich people's homes where she's teaching lessons and where they have a recital at someone's home. It's like this little bubble of an arcane dying culture, you know, and they only at certain, there's only a few points in the movie where you go outside of this world and there's a shopping mall and like an ice skating rink, a porn theater. She plays this recital at this rich person's home, and it's a private little recital, and, you know, they're saying like, oh, you know, so few families carry on this tradition. It's really a shame, you know, this kind of like, it's really a shame that this is going the way of the dodo, you know. It's beautiful. I love it, you know, I love it. I don't want the West to die. Do I care? Kind of, yeah. It's that kind of upper class thing where it's not about money, you know, it's about culture. It's about class. You know what I mean? Not just class like socioeconomic, but like the socio part, you know? Erica's broke, you know, but she has clout in this world because she's a respected, you know, practitioner of this like ancient, beautiful art form. Again, I don't have the film expert language to give examples really, but I mean the camera work, the directing, how things are framed, you know, the rhythm of the editing and everything, the shots are gripping. I mean, the tension that is built, that Haneke builds, is like really, really like physical, man. You really feel it. And then when things start to unravel, you feel that. So yeah, you could talk about it, obviously, just in a purely psychological context. You know, you get some hints about what's up with the mother, how she ended up, you know, this way. Or you can look at it in more political, historical, you know, cultural criticism terms. You know, it's the bourgeois class, bourgeois culture of, you know, like Europe from the Enlightenment forward, the sexual repression of that, like supposedly emotional repression, you know, sort of the way supposedly the high culture of Europe is, I suppose, somewhat weird about the body, I guess, right? There's also feminist angles you could take on it. I know Alfred Jelinek, who wrote the novel, she was both a feminist and a communist. So, I mean, I'm sure that those, you know, these critiques of this culture are coming from both those angles from her, I'm sure. But again, the way I'm going to bring it around in a little bit is to this very specific musical technical issue of notation and writing things down. Her main specialty is Schubert, all right? She also loves Schumann. I used to get them confused, Schubert and Schumann. But yeah, it's mainly Schubert, and that's really the soundtrack for the entire movie is Schubert. And it's specifically the song cycle Winterreise, which is a setting of the poems of Wilhelm Müller. And the whole theme of this piece, Winterreise, is basically just a forlorn, heartbroken young man who is leaving the comfort of the village and wandering off into these twisted, snowy ice paths of into the wilderness and into the unknown and into death. You know, it's called Winter's Journey. So it's this vibe of like a turning point, you know? There's this sense of a tipping point, waking up from comfort and from slumber into something more mysterious or maddening, you know, a sense of leaving oneself, leaving comfort. Toward the beginning of the movie, when they're at this recital, Erica is talking to Clemmer, her love interest and student, and she's talking to him about Schumann, not Schubert, but talks about how Schumann's best work is right when he was losing his mind, right when he was about to go crazy, because Schumann lost his mind. And she quotes Adorno. She talks about how Adorno talks about Schumann losing his mind. And we also know that Schubert, who wrote Winterreise, you know, the soundtrack for this film, Schubert wrote that piece right around the time that he was cracking up too. He had syphilis, and, you know, that was one of the ways people lost their mind back in those days, you know. So in both Erica's life and in the life of Schubert, the composer, and Schumann, there's this tipping point of sanity. And in the song, there's this tipping point toward the unknown. And so this is the tension that's set up at the beginning. Now, going deeper on a musical historical level, Schubert and Schumann, they were around in the early 19th century, like right in the beginning. That's a tipping point as well. Okay, by the way, I'm going to bring this around to musical notation soon. Don't worry. and perversion. These composers, Schubert and Schumann, they're coming at the transition point from classical to romantic music, right? Classical meaning specific classical, like Mozart, Haydn, right? Whereas, in the 19th century, you get romantic music, which is a lot more stormy, passionate, fiery. It's about like intense emotion, drama, high drama, histrionics. It's about the composer's soul being bared, the dark corners. At this point in Western music, I don't want to oversimplify it or over-determine it, but, when you think of like the 18th century, 17th and 18th, you're dealing with scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and it's really like high point, and this really ascendant bourgeois class and just that whole culture of like reason. The 19th century is where that starts to kind of begin to slip. Gradually, with this sort of destabilizing, more untethered emotional darkness, I guess you could say. Reason is already starting to slip at the beginning of the 19th century, right? Schubert is at that turning point. So now, something that's interesting to me is when I was thinking about that, I was like, okay, like we're talking about early romantic music, but then I was like, okay, Erika Kohut, who's this Schubert scholar, she's like the most unemotional, repressed person in the world. She's tamped down her emotions and desires and eroticism down into this perverse, twisted diamond of self-harm and like just twisted horror. How is she really dealing with emotion? She's not emotional. This is where notation comes in, okay? She's constantly berating her students for playing the music wrong, right? But she's never berating them for wrong notes. She says, like several times, she's like, a wrong note doesn't matter as much as getting the feeling wrong, the expression wrong. But her whole thing is about the expression that is written into the score, like the markings, okay? She's like riding her students brutally because they're not expressing the emotion of the music exactly the way Schubert wrote it in the score. When she's giving a lesson to Walter Klemmer, her love interest, she's yelling at him. She's like, what does this say? Forte. And what does that say? Mezzo forte. What does that say? Triple piano. Quiet. You don't understand anarchy if you can't play these dynamic markings. And it's like weird. She's like talking about anarchy? Like, anarchy is not what she's bringing to the world publicly. But this is the thing. The dynamic markings are what's important, the writing. That's the only way she can do fire, passion, anarchy, is in the form of text, the instructions. And apparently, I didn't even really think about this until recently, but the 19th century, that's the actual time when expression markings start to become a big thing, and even dynamic markings. That wasn't as big of a thing in Mozart, Beethoven, and it definitely wasn't as much of a thing in Bach. Markings like, dolce, sweetly, molto cantabile, un poco misterioso, stuff like that, telling you what vibe to have. And also the dynamic markings, in earlier centuries, it was more just like loud, medium, soft, whatever. Whereas in the 19th century, you get like triple piano, double piano, these like subtle variations. Like you could look at it as like, okay, emotion and expression is becoming more of an important value in the 19th century aesthetically, right? Passion, drama. So therefore, the expression markings are supporting that and bringing that out and helping with that. But then like in a way, I'm thinking it's actually a way of controlling that. It's like this fire is coming up in like the Western European soul, that's breaking through the grid of rationality and Enlightenment reason. This sort of darker, chaotic stuff is starting to seep out, and the writing system is trying to contain that and kind of make sure that it's all like accounted for and tallied up at the end of the day. If this is going to be a mysterious piece, it better say un poco misterioso. That's a little mysterious. If it's going to be really mysterious, it better say molto misterioso or whatever. I never write expression markings in my music, ever. But then again, it's sort of what I write, it's like obvious kind of the way it's supposed to be played, Okay, so here's where that stuff about passion, emotion, and notation come back around with her whole perversion and, Erika's twisted S&M relationship with Walter Klemmer, she gives him this note. She gives him this list of what to do to her. It's like this itemized, highly detailed list. Like he reads from it at first in disgust and then later like going along with it. It's like, if I scream, tighten the belt 2 or 3 notches. If I say this, do that. Hit me with the back of your hand. Hit me with the front of your hand if you do this. It's very, very meticulously notated. And, this is a typical, I'm not really part of that kink world, but just, that's a typical thing, I think, where a masochist is kind of taking charge, right? The masochist wants to be beaten and dominated and humiliated, but they're calling the shots by telling the sadist what to do, right? That's a standard thing. But this thing about writing it down, to me, because she's not saying it verbally, so there's something there with this fetish for writing. Like when she hands him this thick envelope filled with her most brutal desires, it's like a composition. It's like she wrote a score for him to perform. This is the thing, when I think of classical music, the first thing I think of is notation. Like writing down music, to me, that's like fact one about classical music. Before the instruments, the orchestra, the violin, before any technical aspect, other than just writing. And I'll tell you, this power dynamic involving written notation, the sort of perverse side of it, I've actually had, this thing in the movie kind of echoes experiences that I've had, not in a sexual realm. I'm not into this filth, man. Not anymore. But experiences I've had when I work with classical players, when I've written down compositions for classically trained players to play, I've gotten in these moments of weird power shit, especially when it'll be like, I'll write something, right? And they'll start playing it and it'll be kind of hard to play. It'll be like, oh, it's a little tricky or doesn't really sound right or something. And then I'll be like, you know what? Let's just simplify it. Let's just take it down an octave, or let's just make it eighth notes instead of triplets, something like that, right? I'll be like, let's change it. And the player, often a woman, not always, but they just won't let you change it. They're like, no, I can get it. We're not changing this. And I'm like, no, let's change it. It's like, no, I must do it. And they're just like masochistically just beating themselves up to try to perform this thing where I'm happy to change it, and you really feel like you're sort of forcing people to do things that they don't totally want to do, but they want to do it, but they don't. It has in the past felt somewhat perverse, And there is a way sometimes where a performer and even the composer, you end up following through or trying to follow through or feeling like you have to follow through on certain things that are written in the score. Even if they're not really working out, you still just feel like you've got to just do them. And it's this weird thing where it's almost like the score itself becomes the master, not just the master composer person who wrote it. And there's something like that in the film too, when Klemmer is finally, obliging Erica and carrying out her sadistic requests, commands, her sort of composition of sadism that she's written for him to perform. When he finally is like, all right, I'll do this, fine. And it's like he starts doing it. He's kind of getting into it, but he's kind of just following instructions. When things get really dark and he really starts to go for it and lash out at her, there's this moment where he's like, not like you pictured, is it? And she's like, gives this look like, no, And I mean, she likes it, but it's not exactly how she pictured it. She's never experienced someone do that, presumably. And there's this moment where it's like they're both kind of caught in the game of like the score now is now master. They're just like carrying out this thing with little agency, either of them, It really reminds me of a performer thing, a composer-performer thing. So, I'm hardly the first person to sort of get into this way that notating music for players to perform, that it can get perverse and kind of maniacal and out there. There's a whole so-called new complexity movement, which I guess that's like 70s and 80s through now, I suppose, is when that comes out. Brian Ferneyhough being the main guy. There's a lot of Brits involved. Tim Dillon is another guy. Finnessy is another guy. I think Michael Finnessy. I don't know all of their music. Ferneyhough I know, and a little bit of Tim Dillon. It's awesome. James Dillon. I just said Tim Dillon. It's fucking James Dillon. Tim Dillon has never written hyper complex chamber music, although I would like it if he did. What these guys of the new complexity movement were doing in the 70s and through now, I suppose, is just writing the most technically complex notated music that like Western music has ever seen. Stuff that you have to play it perfectly, you really could never do it, no matter how technically skilled you are, no matter how much effort and time you put into it. There's no way you could nail this stuff unless you were a computer. The idea isn't to play it perfectly. And so this is the sort of the perversion that comes in with this sort of power games. I think the idea with a lot of these new complexity composers was that trying to play this perfectly, the struggle, the suffering of trying to nail this unplayable music creates a vibe. You know, it creates this tension. It's like the classical civilized version of like Captain Beefheart throwing his musicians down the stairs. There is a certain sadism on his part, or a masochism on the player's part. Although in the case of Erica, she's the person notating it is the masochist, and the guy carrying out the orders is the sadist. But in any case, power, writing, games, caught in the text. So that's the angle that I was most fascinated with the piano teacher on. And I mean, it really did feel like, you know, outside of music and music history, there is this way that it's I'm not going to say an indictment, but a critique of the modern post-Enlightenment European culture, the culture of literacy, which we hold dear and love, writing everything down. I haven't read Derrida in years, but I remember that his book Of Grammatology, it's like kind of his big hit. I know that he gets into the so-called violence of the letter. I don't remember if it has to do with this directly at all. It's S&M-y stuff with writing, but it can't be too far off. So if there were more hours in a day, I would go read some Derrida right now. I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to make the next video because I'm front-loading the stuff, and I'm going to trickle out the videos over the course of the fall. Anyway, The Piano Teacher, absolutely one of the deepest movies I've ever seen. If you love classical music and the darker side of human sexuality and just the death of the West, if you want to just bust a nut watching the West die in front of your face, look no further than this movie.